Okay, welcome. This is the last lecture of the winter lecture series. Thank you for being here. And how many of you were here to hear James Hessler's speaking today? Isn't it wonderful you can come to Gettysburg National Park and do seminars throughout the day like this, and your tax dollars at work? And yeah, okay. Well, thank you for being here, and this will be the last one. Of course, here within the park internally, we think of tomorrow as a big day, March the 12th, because we get to wear our summer uniforms. So, you all didn't know that, but this is symbolically, an ending of the winter and a passing on to the spring. But today we're going to talk about the American Civil War as the first modern war. And I've got some broad points to make, contextual points to make, to try to put the war itself into context in world history. And then I have a lot of details, stories that have to do with the actual modernization of the war. We'll look at newfangled weaponry and those kinds of things. So now we start with big picture. You always want to answer the why and the so what questions when you're doing history. So let's start with the big questions and the big points. How can the Civil War be the first modern war? What context do we have to consider that it's the first modern war? Well, in the broader context of the Renaissance, it does. For 15 years, I taught at Harrisburg Area Community College in the history department. I taught credit courses in the evening while working here by day. I would work there by evening, and this would be a point that I would make over several weeks. So we just kind of create kind of a quick outline, a quick bullet list here of how the 19th century and how the American Civil War comes to be really the first modern century and the first modern war. We start with Renaissance. The Renaissance is from about 1400 to 1600. And when you think of Renaissance, you think of Leonardo da Vinci and Michelangelo and Raphael and Botticelli and some of the artists and how they brought three dimension to their sculptures and to their paintings. You also think of the humanist writers, of which we think of Chaucer and his Canterbury Tales, and we also think about Shakespeare, and there are a number of famous writers that come out of that Renaissance period. Machiavelli's part of that same milieu. And the Renaissance it literally means a new birth. It's or reborn. It's the idea that the Middle Ages were starting to give way to culture again. The Renaissance prided itself, those who helped shape the Renaissance, they prided themselves and linking themselves back with antiquity, with ancient Rome and ancient Greece and ancient Egypt, and they wanted to forget that middle period, the Middle Ages, where culture went backwards. So the Renaissance fueled humanism. Humanism recognizes human potential, and so that became the spark or the seed for the movements that would follow. The science revolution would be the next major movement. And so when you think of science revolution, you think of Galileo, you think of Tycho Brahe, you think of Isaac Newton, and they tried to scientifically explain the heavens. They tried to mathematically come up with equations and quadrants and calculus, and all of that was invented in the 1600s and 1700s to try to explain the universe in logical mathematical terms. This was an attempt to deliberately reject the superstition of the Middle Ages. Astrology was giving way to, let's scientifically explain what we see in the sky. So the Renaissance sparked that with its humanist movement, then the science revolution, then the Enlightenment. In the Enlightenment, you've heard the names Locke, Rousseau, Voltaire, Diderot, Hume, Bacon, and Thomas Jefferson. These were individuals who said, okay, if the Isaac Newtons of the world can explain the universe scientifically, let's explain human needs, human government scientifically. And so they came up with political science. The idea, I used to work at Independence Hall in Philadelphia in the 1980s as a ranger and gave tours there where the Declaration and the Constitution were both written and signed. And the story there is our founding fathers wanted to apply science to human behavior. Our Constitution was written scientifically to try to rule out monarchies, dictatorships, to try to bring balance to government, to try to create a more perfect union. And in that same tradition, you had people like Frederick the Great and Napoleon and their disciples come along and write about the military in a scientific way. So by the middle 1700s and into the early 1800s, you had these books called The Art of War that would try to scientifically explain in formulas, not unlike Newton and Galileo tried to explain the universe mathematically. You had people like Baron von de Jomini and others writing formulas. Napoleon's Maxim did the same. The idea that if you're going to make a direct frontal assault, you should have a 3-to-1 ratio advantage over the defender whom you're attacking if you want to carry the position. Those are the kind of things they thought about. If you divide your forces in the face of an enemy, you can be defeated in detail and those kinds of things. So they thought scientifically about the military. And so industrialization then is kind of the bookend on this discussion about the Renaissance starting the thought process of science. The industrialization became the application of science to everyday life. And we're going to see some of those industrial breakthroughs as we go along today. But industrialization became the practical application of science to human affairs, to human government. Max Weber, who you see there on your right, and Karl Marx on your left, we're not necessarily fans of them, we're not fans of them, but we have to, if we're going to talk about what is a modern war, we have to acknowledge these two philosophers and writers in the 19th century define the notion of what is pre-modern world versus a modern world and a postmodern world. Pre-modern, there's really a long definition if you were to go back and look at Communist Manifesto, but the short of it is pre-modern has to do with agriculture, it has to do with energy sources related to wind power, water power, literal horsepower, human power, and that's the way of the world for most of history has been pre-modern. But then the steam engine was invented by Isaac Watts in 1784, which set in motion a modern world. And we'll see the application of steam. It just changed the world. It's not unlike President Clinton signing legislation in 1994 that commercialized the internet, and it went from an internal thing used by the government to suddenly commercialized. And the day that that was signed, all malls were dead, and we didn't know it yet. You know, we had to wait and watch that play out, and the Walmarts and the Targets of the world are still reeling from that signature. But that's how technology works. The modern era would be the 19th century, and we'll define it as we go along. Let me say something in passing about postmodernism. Postmodernism is a theory that certain economic historians hold on to, that eventually there'll come a time when nationalism, when competitions between nations, imperialism, colonialism, religious zealousy, and all will eventually give way to a global world where everyone sort of blends together. And that postmodernism is controversial, obviously, but that's been foretold and predicted by philosophers, and some look to it as a reality. Okay, so the Civil War then falls within that broader context of the Renaissance to these various movements up to the point of industrialization thanks to the steam engine. And so let's look at how the North was modernizing on the eve of the Civil War. You're looking at a picture or a lithograph of Frederick Jones' shoes from the 1850s. There were over 1,300 shoe factories in Massachusetts in 1860, 60,000 plus employees in Massachusetts involved in shoes. A few years ago, I got a chance to speak in Lynn, Massachusetts at the GAR Hall there. And it's a wonderful visit if you get a chance to go. And they took me to the Lynn Shoe Factory. Well, it's some of those buildings are gone now, but they took me to the district where the original buildings were. Lynn, Massachusetts was also a major producer of shoes, produced shoes for Civil War soldiers. So contracts for the Union Army during the war looked to factories like Frederick Jones and looked to factories like the ones in Lynn. So the North was industrializing. That's industrialization. Industrialization is the outgrowth of the science applied to political economies. Also, the North was becoming modernized through other examples, such as McCormick Reapers. And here's a picture of McCormick Reapers in 1847. McCormick Reaper was to the West into wheat, the Midwest into wheat production, what the cotton gin was to the South in cotton production. It revolutionized the Midwest to be the breadbasket of the country, and in some cases, the whole world. The McCormick Reaper, it's a complex machine that would pull in grains, and it cut down on the laborious aspects of gathering wheat. By 1853, the North was modernizing in yet other ways through the Singer sewing factory. And so Singer sewing machines allowed for textile mills to produce even more, because now you had these sewing machines, and there would be a room where all of these sewing machines were set up, and there was a pedal that you would press, and that's how you powered it. How many of you are familiar with that? Yes, okay. And but there were also steam-powered ones as well, connected through pulley systems and belts. Connecticut clocks. This is a picture of one such clock factory in New Haven, Connecticut, in the 1840s. So Connecticut was known for clocks, just like Massachusetts was known for shoes. Lowell Mills, by 1850, had converted from water power to steam power. And they were producing textiles in a major way. The Springfield Armory also represents industrialization and modernization, in that within the Springfield Armory, they were using jigs, fixtures, gauges, templates to replicate parts in such a way where you could make interchangeable parts. That's important to note. In the late 1980s, I worked for 2 seasons at 2 years at the Valley Forge National Military Park, and my role was to wear a tricorn hat and sit around a campfire on weekends for 2 years. And I was stuck in the year 1777, 1778. But as I did that, in that time period, the Brown Besses that they carried and the Charlottesville muskets that they carried into battles, if they were damaged, they were only used from that point on as corduroy for the roads. You couldn't do anything with them. Because they were made by a gunsmith by hand, and the parts were not interchangeable. By the time of the Civil War, thanks to Springfield Armory and Harper's Ferry Armories, you had these machines that could replicate parts. When you read accounts sometimes of the Battle of Gettysburg in the immediate aftermath, you read of Union contingents, regiments going around the battlefield with horse and carriage, picking up rifles and throwing them in the back of a wagon. And what are they doing? They're sending them back to Springfield to be reconditioned, because you could just replace parts and use them again. When I worked in Appomattox in 1984, one of the points we would make there, people would ask, this is where they surrendered, this is where the Confederates gave up all their weapons, where are those weapons? And it was, I suppose, kind of silly, but the Confederates worried that if they surrendered their weapons, that would be used against them by other Union forces combating other Confederate forces still in resistance from Virginia through North Carolina all the way to Texas. And so there were some Confederates who buried their rifles, and those sort of things still turn up today. There's stories of complete cannons being buried. And it's silly, because the North had more than enough. They took the Confederate weapons that they gathered at the surrender and used them for corduroy in the route back to Washington as their armies marched back towards a victory celebration in Washington, D.C. But the Springfield Armory then represents industrialization, modernization. And if you study the history of technology, this is a really important, the Armory in Springfield is really important because it represents the introduction of interchangeable parts. Singer's sewing machines were There were interchangeable parts there too, but they still had to do some filing to make things fit better. The first fully assembled devices that you could buy would be Western bicycles in the 1890s. And then Henry Ford perfected it in 1914 with full assembly. Once you have full assembly, it was sort of the end of the craft tradition, which is tragic and sad. I suppose from a technology perspective, though, it represents the fulfillment of what Springfield Armory started. The North was modernizing too economically. Banks were starting to appear all throughout the North. I should say this in the way of background, that if you were to travel back to 1810, 18-teens, 1820s, there were virtually no banks. There was a national bank and then very few, and there were some wildcat banks in the 1830s that printed their own money and or depended on loans from state banks. But banks were very limited and because there was not a lot of capital in this country. If you really wanted a loan, let's say to buy expensive material to build a railroad, you had to take a loan either from Great Britain or you took a loan from a merchant who would dock in New York Harbor, for instance, or Charleston. And so money was handled not through banks but merchants. Well, that was changing by the 1850s. There was more and more money being generated by industrialization in the North. So you had banks. Wall Street came into existence. In Chicago, they had their Union Stockyard by 1865, but that was on the heels of having produced 3 times more beef, over 100,000 pounds of beef per year they produced for the Union armies during the war. So then Chicago, as the war was ending, went ahead and opened their stock exchange. Telegraphs helped stock markets come into existence too. Why? Because knowledge is power. If you can get information on an incredible crop, let's say out Midwest, of incredible bounty of wheat, and you know about it and you're living in New York City, you can buy it by telegraph because you got the news by telegraph. You buy it before anyone else and then you sell it at higher shares to everyone else. You make a profit. So, you know, the telegraph went hand in hand with the stock markets. The North was modernizing. I think I mentioned this to Larry the other day, just because Larry and I have these good discussions about the Erie Canal, that occasionally in the classroom this provocative point is made, that the Civil War would not have been fought without the construction of the Erie Canal. When it was completed in 1825, it linked the Hudson with Lake Erie, which linked New York through Lake Erie to the Midwest, and specifically more so than any other place, Chicago. But you know, the Midwest today we consider Indiana, Illinois, Michigan, Minnesota, and Ohio, and we would consider those the Midwest states. Those states prior to the Erie Canal's construction were economically connected with St. Louis and New Orleans and the Gulf via what body of water? The Mississippi. And so the Erie Canal, the argument goes, connected the Midwest economically with the Northeast. And then rail just reinforced that. And then after those political connections were rearranged, then eventually there were political alignments that went along with that. So sectionalism, which is a major cause of the Civil War, the South and North eventually just virtually not speaking and not trading. The Erie Canal played a role in that. But it's all part of pulling the North together towards modernization. And then rail eventually would just reinforce all of that. So the stage was set for the first modern war. You had steam ships, steam trains, steam factories, and so on. So now we're moving from the very broad to the very specific now. And we're going to talk about, let's start with balloons. And I'm going to tell a lot of stories. I love telling stories, and narratives are fun, but they're meaningful stories and they help make the point. One of the mediums or lenses that we look at the past through is through people. You know, great events, great men, great women. But then if we refine the great men and great women as a lens to look at the past through, there's also conflict between men and men and men and women. That's a major theme all throughout history. Envies and jealousies and conflict, and it goes on, and competition. And Thaddeus Lowe and John LaMountain both had the desire to be the chief contractor for balloons in the Union Army. And so they would approach not just the Army of the Potomac, but they would approach officials in Washington and make their bid to be the supplier of balloons. And before I move on from them, let me say something about how aero pilots were received back then. Aero pilots, or balloon pilots, if you will, were seen in the armies as eccentric people. They dressed a little bit different. They carried sextants in their hands, these instruments for measurement. They carried these bulky contraptions and these hydrogen inflators, and they had wagons. They were given titles that gave them status, but the average soldier never acknowledged them as official military. So chains of command were always precarious, trying to work through the contracted balloonist. And then I'll make a broader point about that. Some of you have been out with me on my Samuel Johnston walk, and he did the reconnaissance for General Longstreet's attack on the Union left, Round Tops and Wheatfield, and that part of the battlefield. And you know that Samuel Johnston, there were problems after the war when Confederate veterans corresponded with him about exactly what he was doing, and did he make it to Little Round Top, and could he have made it to Little Round Top, and seen what he saw or not seen what he saw. Some of you know that story real well. Well, one of the problems with Samuel Johnston in the Army of Northern Virginia is that he would be considered an outsider, not unlike the balloonist. This eccentric subcontractor that was brought in, it was not official Army, and we don't know if we should listen to him or not. He didn't go to West Point, and he doesn't wear our uniform, and we're not sure where he falls into our... So the average soldier would have walked past both of these individuals and looked at them, strangely. Thaddeus Lowe eventually got the primary contract, and he would send up balloons not only along the Rappahannock River and the Rapidan, and he would keep a constant eye on the Confederates, but he would also send up his balloon in other places and in Virginia, depending on where the armies moved. And the Intrepid is synonymous with Thaddeus S.D. Lowe. Now, the Intrepid, one incident involving it was captured in a flight from Cincinnati to Charleston. It just so happened to land right after the firing on Fort Sumter. That's really bad timing, isn't it? And so, after some explanations and some official letters, the Confederates let him go, and he made it back north again. But I mention that story because that story spread throughout the South, and it also spread through portions of the Union armies as well. And so it just added towards the mistrust that the average soldier had towards an aero pilot. Here's an individual that floated off course for, it seemed like, several hundred miles, or that's how the story evolved. The average soldier in the ranks also looked at a balloonist in light of going to a county fair or a carnival. They would go there, and you would have the balloon ride, and you'd see have you ever taken a balloon ride and you hear the fire go? I don't know how that sounds on Facebook, but the balloon would go up on a tether, and then you would be able to look across the countryside. And those balloons were a novelty. And they seem to be a carny act, and they seem to be the outgrowth of maybe a charlatan-like behavior. So the average soldier in the ranks did not know what to do with the aero pilot. Okay, and so Thaddeus Lowe did most of the ballooning near Confederate lines. Notice the contraptions here that one contraption I made a reference to is the hydrogen and or oxygen tanks that would inflate the balloons. These balloons were very prop heavy. And of course, tethered means you're using a rope or a chain to allow the balloon to go up to a certain distance. And we can see one of the pilots there on his mission. And the balloons would be raised to a certain level so that a telegrapher could telegraph what he saw from this bird's eye perspective. And the telegrapher would have cartography abilities, and so they would map make. I suppose the equivalent today would be Google Earth. But they would be high above, and there was a point just before the Gettysburg campaign where the Federal armies had, Thaddeus Lowe would have had upwards of 7 balloons tethered above the Rappahannock, watching the Confederate movement south of the Rappahannock all throughout the day and watching their campfires at night. And so when General Lee stole a march to come north, you may not know this, but as he moved north around the Federal right flank into the Shenandoah, Cumberland Valley, and began going north up through Maryland toward Pennsylvania, as he did that, the Confederates left a lot of campfires burning to keep the balloonist unsuspicious of the flanking maneuver that was occurring. The Confederates, other ways that they tried to fool the balloonist, the aero pilot, is they would cut down trees to the trunk and then paint the trunks black so they looked like artillery pieces from the sky. But this is very precise as we talk about the first modern war. The balloonist on a tether could save a lot of running around and a lot of wasted time and energy if they spotted what looked like to be Confederate movements of cavalry or infantry. The aero pilot could make a precise reading, and that would allow him to telegraph that to the ground, and that would allow a commander to send out a precise number of cavalry to check it out, to debunk it, or to affirm it. And this is the George Washington Parke Custis floating from a coal barge on the Potomac early in the war. This would be considered, along with the teaser. Some of you know that the Confederates had a barge like this that floated up and down the James River during the Peninsula Campaign in May and June of 1862. And a balloon was connected to the barge so that McClellan's line could be studied from the air. You know who the pilot was in that one Confederate balloon? Edward Porter Alexander, who commanded artillery, for Pickett's charge here. So he would have been one of those eccentric people that somehow eventually fit in. But the balloon being pulled along by the barge has caused modern technology historians to say these were the first examples of modern aircraft carriers. So there you go, okay. Okay, and then you have, notice I'm jumping around to different themes. The broader theme is the science revolution, which leads to industrialization, which leads to the first modern war. But there's some other themes going on just underneath that, and this one of those is personalities and how they come into play. And here we see Joseph Henry and Samuel F.B. Morse, and when you think of them, you immediately think of Morse code, and you think of the telegraph. Joseph Henry was working with electromagnetism and impulses that were communicated in a telegraph fashion before Morse and inspired Morse. But as is so often the case, one person gets the credit, and then there are others that are discovered a little bit later. Thomas Edison wasn't the only person that worked with electricity. Have you ever heard of Nikola Tesla? Right? But only recently is Tesla getting his due, and it took over a century. But there's usually one person that beats the others to the patent office. That allows me to make this point, this broader contextual point, and it is, if you go back and do a little research on your own when the program's on, just go online and check, type in how many patents were there in the 19th century filed to the government in Washington, D.C. in the 19th century, and it's thousands. Everyone became their own personal inventor. If you read, there was this incredible fascination with science. And so this is a really good broader contextual point. If you read diaries and memoirs, Let me stick with diaries in particular. If you read diaries of the 19th century, oftentimes the person keeping the diary starts out every morning with the weather, temperature. They'll go outside and record those. They thought of themselves as their own personal scientists. In the early 1920s, people would buy radio kits and build their own radios, and they thought of themselves as scientific doing that. So there was this fascination about science that started with the Renaissance and carried all the way up, even to this present day as I hold this device in front of you. It's a modern version of what we're about to talk about. Okay, and so in the field, the telegraph wires were called the grapevine. Have you heard that expression? I heard it through the grapevine. That's where it comes from. And the grapevine connected for the first time, we're talking about the First Modern War, for the first time in human history, divisional headquarters and corps headquarters were connected by wire so that there was communication within the lines. And I'm thinking of Frank O'Reilly's excellent book on the Battle of Fredericksburg. You all know that about that book. And one of his arguments is that the main attack, what we think is the main attack at Fredericksburg, Burnside's repeated attacks that seemed futile against Marye's Heights and against the stone wall, Frank argues those were not the main attacks, those were the diversionary attacks. And that Burnside kept ordering them over and over and over, not out of futility, but to try to give William Franklin a chance on his left to coordinate, turn the Confederate right flank, cut them off from Richmond, cut off their water supply along the Rappahannock, cut off the road to Richmond from Fredericksburg. It's an intelligent argument, isn't it? Very, very good argument. And but in any case, and a friend of mine, a very, very smart book. But one of the points that Frank makes is that Burnside set up wires to Franklin so that Franklin and then his subordinates, Reynolds and Meade, would make their attack against Jackson's portion of the line at the right time. That Burnside set up this grapevine to connect the main attack with Franklin, with the diversionary attack of Burnside against Marye's Heights, and that Franklin never hooked up the wire and made the connections. Okay, and that Burnside, when he was brought before the Committee on the Conduct of War in Washington, the congressional hearings, he was the gentleman, took the blame himself, and never put the blame on Franklin. Oh, I should say something technical, because when you're doing technology history, we have to bring in some of the technical aspects too. Impulses. Okay, so through electromagnetism, you have impulses. They were transmitted through copper. Copper could easily break. So you had the option of transmitting these signals through iron, but iron's not a good conductor. So what these telegraphers were doing in the field by the 1860s is they were wrapping copper around the iron to get the best of both worlds, and then wrapping both of them in cloth and putting them underground. Well, the problem with that is the cloth deteriorated and eventually it affected the connection because there would be corrosive qualities with the copper. So it led to what we look at as telephone poles, and so that's why that comes into existence. Telegraph typically followed rail lines because the right-of-way was already cleared with the rail line. You know how today there'll be wires that you'll see, you'll be riding along the highway and you'll look up to the top of a hill and there's cables, high wire cables extending all the way up, and these magnificent towers, and there's a clearing in the woods that go all the way up to the top. But you'll also, if you look carefully, you'll see cell phone towers in that same space. And the reason is because the utility company already has a right-of-way, which if you're a cell phone company, you use that right-of-way and you don't have to invent the wheel all over again and getting permissions across private properties. And it's the same is true with the telegraph. The telegraph ran along rail because that was already circumvented through people's properties. Also, rail followed the shortest distance between 2 points. Roads will meander. Rail tends to go very straight. And then rail is a good plumb bob or a chalk line to guide on. Armies tended to follow rail because they knew that as if they looked on the map and followed rail, it would always lead them to where they were going. It was an axis that they could trust. Notice I have the letters LOC. That stands for lines of communication. That's a military term. Lines of communication also includes lines of supply. If you're advancing along a rail line, not only can you control the rail and protect it, but you have communications the whole way. Communications meaning supply trains coming up as well as control of the telegraph. So the telegraph would follow rail, and armies tended to march along rail. It's not a coincidence that Robert E. Lee's army followed the Cumberland Valley rail line, and that Stuart's cavalry followed the Northern Central rail line, and that they were to meet up in Carlisle. There's a rail line the whole way, you know. So it was all rail line would dictate a lot of those things. And then as we continue to talk about the first modern war, and I look at the clock and time's just running away from me here, but there were two companies that were private companies that immediately helped out the armies, and one was the American Telegraph Company, the other the Western Telegraph. The American Telegraph was preferred early on by the Union Army, but the trouble with the American Telegraph Company was that it ran across sectional lines from north to south. So when the war started, something like half of their customers were in alien territory, that is, in enemy territory. So financially, American Telegraph did not survive the sectional split. Western Telegraph survived really all the way up to modern times. Western Telegraph still exists, and they ran more laterally, more horizontally, more east to west, and that helped them survive. Then a subcategory under that would be the military telegraph, and the military telegraph was tied to signals and signal flag corps. And so let's talk a little bit about the Signal Corps and relate that to the telegraph. Now, let's use a personal example, Little Round Top. Little Round Top, along with Cemetery Hill and Powers Hill, were the three primary signal flag stations here at Gettysburg. I imagine most of you knew that. And so at any given time, you would see someone standing with a white flag with a red border or a red flag with white trim, and that flag would be waved from atop Little Round Top to, let's say, to a signal station on Cemetery Hill and over to Powers Hill. The Confederates watched all these signals, by the way, trying to decode them, and were not able to break the code. You hear sometimes coaches complaining about someone watching their signals on the sideline. The armies did that during the Civil War too. But you would see the flag, for instance, if you were on Cemetery Hill and you were looking through your field glasses from your signal station on Cemetery Hill to the Union signal station on Little Round Top, as you looked through your field glasses and you saw the flag waggle a couple of times to the right and then maybe once forward, you took out your cipher disc and turned that might be the letter H or the letter L. And so they were able to communicate through what's called aerial telegraphy or semaphore communication. Now, balloons were not here at Gettysburg. Remember, we talked about balloons. And one reason that they were not here is because the Confederates tore out so much rail, it was impossible to transport them from Northern Virginia. Secondly, the battle happened so quickly, relatively speaking, after General Lee left Virginia, that there wasn't time for all Federal logistics to catch up. And the balloons were bulky, and they needed rail transportation to be there. Well, how did the Federals compensate here at Gettysburg? They picked the hilltops that I mentioned so that they could communicate. That information would be transcribed and then passed to generals, and generals would communicate. There was a telegraph station, by the way, out on Hanover Road near East Cavalry Battlefield. That was another one. And then there was one for a short while on Stevens Knoll or McKnight's Knoll next to Culp's Hill. So the Federals were using those signal stations effectively. And the Confederates Confederates were on the outside. The Federals had the interior lines. So their communications wouldn't be easily seen by flag across Union lines. Can you see that problem? It's another problem with exterior lines. Now today that can be overcome through what's called superlateral communication. Superlateral communication is wireless communication, it's aviation, it's satellite communication. So you no longer need interior lines to communicate quickly. You have technological advancements that compensate for all that, and you have transportation systems that can take you, let's say, from one side or other of an interior position just as fast as if you had interior lines. So now the signal station, how do you like my GIF there? I was real proud of that. And the signal station on Little Round Top, this is fascinating now. They communicated with Jack's Mountain, which is about 12 miles west of here, out in the vicinity of Fairfield and Ski Liberty, and if you know where to look, you can see it from Little Round Top. On Jack's Mountain for a while, until the Confederates went up to the top of it on July 3rd and ran the signal station off and captured a few. Prior to that, the Jack's Mountain signal station waited for signals that General Meade wanted to send to Washington, D.C. They would be sent from Little Round Top to Jack's Mountain. From Jack's Mountain, there was a line of sight to Harper's Hill, which is 4 miles south of Big Round Top. From Harper's Hill, there was a signal station that had a line of sight to Indian Mountain, Indian Lookout Mountain. That would be where Mount St. Mary's is. From there, the Western Maryland, from there, the Western Maryland line did not have telegraph. You all like this kind of information? If you want credibility, you want to bring details into a discussion. There was a group called the Adams Express, and there were 12 horses, and the horses would run at breakneck speed even to their death or premature death to carry messages from Emmitsburg to just north of Baltimore. And from Baltimore, along the B&O, telegraph communications would go all the way from Baltimore to Washington, D.C. By the way, the station where Adams Express would arrive with the horse from Emmitsburg was called Relay Station, for those that like those kind of details, just north of Baltimore. So theoretically, within 3 hours, a message from Little Round Top could reach the White House. And so that's how they compensated with having to fight the battle before all of those grapevines were in place. Okay, and we're looking at a map that's put out by the Census Bureau in concert with the University of Nebraska at Lincoln. And it's on the Hofstra page. And it shows us what rail lines look like in 1860 and where the greatest populations were near those rail centers. Now, it's important as we talk about rail as part of the First Modern War to make the point that the North had a lot more rail than the South did. Can you see that? The South typically, if you do a study of Southern railroads before the Civil War, the South tended to build rail lines from places like Charleston, South Carolina, Wilmington, North Carolina, Savannah, Georgia, on an east-west construction out to somewhere in the Piedmont region of one of those states, and then it didn't connect to anything. So there were no trunks that they were intentionally connected to. The North had a problem with their rail lines. They had trunks. Like there was a trunk in Harrisburg, for instance, that brought together several lines, one from Delaware, one from Philadelphia, one from the Ohio Valley, and then, of course, from the Northern Central that came up from the B&O at Washington and Baltimore. But the North had the problem that there were many different rail companies, and they were in competition with each other. And they didn't want to unite, and they didn't want the federal government to control their rates. They wanted to have their own company. So you had the Northern Central, the B&O, the Cumberland Valley, the Hanover-Gettysburg line. They had different gauge track. There was no such thing as standard time. That didn't come until the 1880s, where there was Eastern, Western, Pacific, Central time. That would come later because of some horrific train wrecks. The the rail then, the problem then in the North was one company would have a line end in a city like Baltimore, and if you wanted to transfer, there were all this entourage of people, that haulers and carters, that would unpack all of your material from one rail company and put it on the train of another rail company. And that was so you would stay overnight in one of their hotels and dine in their restaurants. That was all part. So that's why, you know, cities were in collusion with these companies. They wanted people to take time to transfer. That caused problems during the Civil War because the rail lines were not integrated. You had different grades of track. You had different gauges, different deepnesses and grades. Some rail had side tracks where you could park vehicles off to the side, others didn't. Now, some of the more famous stories, I told you I wanted to integrate some stories. Some of the more famous stories related to rail during the war and how it's part of the First Modern War was Longstreet's 5,000 troops, you know, McLaws and Hood's divisions transferred to Chickamauga, where the battle was from September 18th to 20th, but they arrived to participate on the 20th. And those 5,000 troops became pivotal in the outcome of Chickamauga in Tennessee. There were 6 different railroad companies used, 775 miles of track. And the Confederates were sitting on the rooftops during the ride, and again, there was no central control and command. That was one of the problems of the Confederacy, their lack of central government. Made it very difficult for all these rail companies to work together and for the military to use them to their advantage. Oh, before I go to this one, let me add a couple more stories. When you think of the Confederacy using rail, another example would be at the Battle of First Manassas, First Bull Run, and the Manassas Gap Railroad was used by Joseph Johnston's troops, and they arrived just in time to support Beauregard against the fight against McDowell at the Battle of First Bull Run. Another famous Southern example of rail bringing troops in the nick of time was Stonewall Jackson's joining of Lee and the 7 Days Battle, or the Peninsula Campaign. After Jackson fought in the Valley, he had his troops board. It was a little more complex, but they eventually boarded the Central Virginia line, and it brought them to just outside of Richmond, where they were able to join Lee's push of McClellan back on the James River and his exit via the Chesapeake. On the Union side, you had an interesting story. The Union 11th and 12th Corps were sent to Tennessee shortly after the Gettysburg Campaign. This would have been in late September of 1863. After the Confederates had shifted troops and won the Battle of Chickamauga, and the Federals had, under Rosecrans, had to fall back on their defenses in Chattanooga, and the Confederates were starting to lay siege there. The Federals countered by taking the 11th and 12th Corps, were later combined, became the 20th Corps. But they were taken from Meade's Army of Potomac, placed on the B&O line, where they would eventually access the Louisville line, and that would take them to essentially the banks of the Tennessee River. And so they were able to travel with 20,000 men, 12,000 miles in less than a week. That's all part of the First Modern War. You have to understand, no previous war has an example of this. So this was all monumental, and technology has always been about who's quicker to adapt. If you adapt to new technology, you have an advantage of people. Those who don't adapt as quickly tend to. It's that way all through history, folks. When you teach the Hittites, they were able to overthrow northern Egypt because they adapted to the new technology of iron, which was stronger in battle than was copper, right? And so it's important, and brass. So if you have a new technology, you put it to use quicker, you're likely to benefit while the other person is catching up to speed. Of the units that were in that shift from Meade's army on the banks of Potomac to Tennessee were 11th and 12th Corps. And one of the brigades was George Sears Green's brigade, Pap Green, that fought on Culp's Hill at Gettysburg here. The 149th New York from Syracuse, and the 60th New York from Ogdenburg, and you can go on down the list. The 137th from Rochester, 137th from Binghamton. And those New York boys, when they were traveling south, they took all kinds of tools, implements, axes, for example, and they chopped up the boxcars so they could get fresh air. And I remember when I was first reading that, I thought, wonder if they used some of the same axes that they built those fortifications on Culp's Hill with. And those folks, those New Yorkers from Geary's brigade could rearrange a train car, a freight car, as well as they could rearrange the earth over on Culp's Hill. I mentioned Ruger NYC. Ruger's brigade of 12th Corps, you all know they fought on Lower Culp's Hill during this battle. They made that ill-fated charge. The 27th Indiana, 2nd Mass, made that ill-fated charge across Spangler Meadow, and they lost a lot of men. Well, they recovered well enough to within just a few weeks after that, they were on a train headed north, and they helped quell or put down the draft riots in New York City. Now, that's pulling double duty, isn't it? But it's not possible without rail, and that's the underlying point here. Hospital trains are important. This is another big picture point. As you all know, there was a hospital here for over 4 months called Camp Letterman, and it was east of Gettysburg, and not far from where Giant Food Store and Walmart is today along the York Pike. There were, at any given time, there were upwards of 1,600 beds, sort of like applying for a nursing home or an institution or a hospital or something, and we had to wait for a bed. But there were still way more troops processed through Camp Letterman than actually had a bed, way more than 1,600. It's a very bad notion to say there were only 1,600 people cared for at Camp Letterman. There were something like 20,000 wounded patients processed through Camp Letterman. Not all of them got a bed, only 1,600 got a bed. Keep in mind, where did the other 18,500 go? They boarded a train not far from where Walmart is today, and they were taken with whatever their wound was. They were taken to Philadelphia, Harrisburg, Baltimore, or Washington, and within a few hours, they went to a place where there was a better ratio of help to need. So they suddenly had a bed and more doctors and nurses caring for them. When I went to Walter Reed Medical Museum a few years ago with another ranger here, and we visited there, they gave us a behind-the-scenes tour, and they let us handle with cotton gloves 2 skulls of people who had fought in this battle that died in Washington, D.C. And the first point they made was those people died something like a week or 2 after the battle in Washington. How did that happen? It's because of rail, the first modern war. Now, let me put that in context. Do you remember after Katrina in 2005, there were all these buses parked outside of New Orleans. And while the city was flooded and helicopters were taking people off their roofs and putting them on buses, the buses took them to Atlanta, to the Houston Astrodome, to San Antonio, and gave them shelter, and pets were being adopted all throughout the United States from there. And there was a dispersal of people from the flood area because the area was overtaxed even for drinkable water. You remember that? Or think of that example as it relates to rail at Gettysburg, dispersing the need into the population where there's a greater ratio of help to need. Isn't that fascinating? Today, if a soldier is wounded in Afghanistan, theoretically, within a few hours, he can be convalescing in Germany, far from the scene of action. And then, theoretically, within a couple of weeks or less than that, he can be at Fort Hood, Texas. Now, his mind is still swimming from what he endured and may for years, and he may never fully recover, but he's geographically far from where he fought. The first war in human history to remove someone from the battlefield that quickly was the Civil War. Gettysburg is a great example of that. First modern war. Now, Hanover Junction would have been the primary link from the northern central to Gettysburg via the Hanover-Gettysburg line. So Hanover Junction was a really important holding area. If you look at some of General Meade's original orders, his Pipe Creek orders, Hanover was one of the 4 options of where the battle might take place. You all know that because of the rail. Okay, that was important. And it turns out the Confederates, the troops that were that far east, Jubal Early's troops, marched back towards the South Mountain, and the battle ended up closer to in Gettysburg. Jubal Early burned 22 bridges from Gettysburg to Hanover Junction. Did you all know that? 22 bridges. These are, so I like to tell people in the field, these are not random acts of violence, and these are not anger management issues. This was intended to target the rail. General Pickett's division, you know one of the reasons why they weren't here at Gettysburg until July 3rd? They were tearing up rail along the Cumberland Valley line. Why? So the Federals couldn't transport troops in from the Ohio Valley to join the fray. Rail's very important, you know. So, and then Lincoln, when he came to speak, he used the same line, and he stopped there. And Grant came there in 1869 and sat there for a while at the Hanover Junction before he came to be hosted by John White Geary, the governor of Pennsylvania, for a tour of Gettysburg. He always wanted to see this battlefield that he'd heard so much about through Meade and other members of Army of Potomac. Disrupting rail was also part of the equation. I've already made a reference to that. It's estimated that between the 4 rail lines I mentioned, the Confederates tore up approximately 100 miles of rail during the Gettysburg campaign. And so there were ways to achieve this. The U.S. MRC is demonstrating this, the United States Military Railroad Construction Corps. Sometimes strategically you would tear up rail, and you can see them at work there. Sabotaging rail was turned into a science by Sherman late in the war, and to Sherman's neckties. But Jeb Stuart did that during the Gettysburg campaign too. You would tear out a certain section of rail, not the entire length of the rail, but just a few ties, set fire to the ties, put the rail across until they melted, twist them and toss them down into the woods. And so then someone would have to come along and repair them. And that was Herman Halp's United States Military Railroad Construction Corps. Did you know Halp was from Gettysburg? He lived in the Schultz house. I know the guides know that. Jim knows that. But his house is beautifully restored. It's right next to the Lutheran Theological Seminary at the juncture of Fairfield Road and the Seminary Avenue. But Halp was the military superintendent of all railroads, or a title very close to that. And he would come along after the Confederates damaged the rail, and he was a wizard at repairing it. And one of his greatest feats, and Lincoln made a special trip just to see it, was the Potomac Creek Bridge. It was 400 feet long, 100 feet high, and it was rebuilt by Halp in 72 hours. And Lincoln made the comment that it was made of bean poles and corn stalks. Have you all heard that before? And it's amazing. He learned the old Etruscan Roman idea of if you crisscross the wood, you create trusses, and then therefore you create more support. And that would inspire high-rise steel cage construction. We have to answer the why and the so whats to all of this. Not only were the Confederates dumbfounded by how quick Halp was able to repair everything, but then Halp's construction inspired Carnegie and his high-rise steel cage construction in Chicago. That's where the idea came from Halp of Gettysburg's trusses. And then let's talk about ironclads briefly. The Secretary of Navy is on your left. That's Gustavus Fox. The inspector of ironclads was Alban Steimers, and the inventor and systems manager was John Erickson on the far right. Here's this sub-theme of mine, an interplay of competing individuals. And these 3 individuals put into the waters on behalf of the Northern Navy. They put into the waters these ironclads. The most famous would be the Monitor and the Merrimac, or the CSS Virginia. The Confederates captured what were the remains of a U.S. ship known as the Monitor, and they converted it into the CSS Virginia. They met on March 9th, 1862, in a classic battle off the shores of the coast of Virginia, and they lobbed shells back and forth. The noise was such that the sailors inside had nosebleeds and earbleeds from the concussions of the noise. Their shells were not able to penetrate either vessel, so after pounding each other for many hours, they disengaged. When that battle was over, all the wooden fleets of the world were obsolete. And so that's the significance of it. The Federal Monitor had the advantage of a revolving turret, which allowed them to line up their guns no matter how the boat itself was situated, whereas the CSS Virginia just had 12 guns broadside, and if the broadside wasn't facing the Monitor, they were in trouble. And so you had a turret that revolved. And so where did the turret construction, where did the ironclad construction come from? It came from forges. This is an interesting point for those who like the study of technology and the development of technology. When Fox, Steimer, and Erickson got together and talked about how to produce mini ironclads, like the Monitor or similar to the Monitor, ones that could be placed in the Gulf, placed in the Mississippi, placed in along the coast. As they had those conversations, then the question was, who are we going to contract to build them? Well, shipbuilders were still building the old technology, which was wooden ships. So they went to forges, to iron forges. And oftentimes the person who agreed to the contract had never built an ironclad before. I would say in all cases they had never built an ironclad. But they took the contract anyway. It was good government money coming in. And they just would hammer it out and build these things according to a design that was given to them. The design, it was originally designed by Erickson. It was improved for aesthetic purposes and artistic purposes by Steimers. And then Gustavus Fox, who was Secretary of the Navy, went ahead and implemented it. But that's what we had going on. And then the Passaic was one of the common ironclads that you would see in the bodies of waters that I mentioned. There were coaling stations. People ask sometimes, why was Florida important during the Civil War? And why were there skirmishers there at times and conflicts there at times? And the answer is, it was an important coaling station along the East Coast. So if you controlled it, you could stop and get coal to continue your journey. Submarines. Well, during the American Revolution, there were submarines, including the most famous American Turtle. But the Civil War would improve upon that with the H.L. Hunley. Remember, I tell my son this sometimes, my 14-year-old son. Thomas Edison was asked about how he invented and praised for inventing the light bulb. And he said, no, don't praise me. I just learned 2,000 ways not to invent the light bulb. And that's hard work and experimentation. Hunley's a similar case. Hunley had several failed missions where people died, even to the point that the Confederate government was leery of giving him another chance. But he decided he wanted to break the naval blockade at Charleston Bay, and so he convinced enough higher-ups that he could do it. And so the Hunley, this is in 1864 now, and we'll look at specifics in a minute. The Hunley had a spar on one end. Can you see the sharp point on the far left? And it was a harpoon of sorts. And so explosives were placed on that harpoon, and you would try to align, if you were navigating the Hunley, the idea was to align the spar so it could be rammed and inserted into the side of a Union ship that was blocking trade in Charleston Harbor. And then that, when retracting, the explosives would fall inside the ship, and then it would blow up. Inside, it had several people turning cranks. Okay, and as we try to look for connections across time and space to look for patterns, the Vikings had oars under ship, you know. But these members of the Hunley, they stood inside of a particular groove, and they would turn the crank. How did they descend? Well, there were ballasts under the ship, and the ballasts could be opened to allow water to come in, and it would sink. And so it would take water, and then when they wanted to come up, they released the water from the ballasts, and it would come back up again. To know that they were running out of oxygen, they had a candle, and as the candle started to flicker, it meant it's time to come up. Well, in the two previous instances where it didn't come up and some people died, they opened the hatches too early and it just flooded. So this was a very tricky thing. But after dark, the Hunley approached the USS Housatonic, a 16-gun sloop of war, on February 17, 1864 in Charleston Harbor, and successfully planted the spar in the ship and sunk it. And the significance was this was the first example in human history, as we talk about the first modern war, the first example in human history of a submersible vessel, a submarine, destroying any sort of floating vessel. And in this case, they destroyed a sloop. And the Hunley was recently raised. How many of you knew that? Just a few years ago, it was 2000, I believe it was raised. And yes, and some of you, were any of you there for the ceremony when they found remains and buried them there in Charleston, and they had a major ceremony? Bernadette Atkins, who's a dear friend of many of you, some of you here probably, and of myself, she used to run the Eastern National Bookstore. And she has a bookstore here in town. Bernadette was there and brought back a stack of pictures for me to look at. She was there for the ceremony to celebrate that they had found it. It's in remarkably good shape, isn't it? And there it is. It's almost kind of haunting to see something like that be found on the bottom of the bay and brought up. The North had their own version. It didn't have any... there were some experimental launches, but it didn't have the prestige of actually sinking an enemy vessel. But nevertheless, they had the technology. It was called the Intelligent Whale. There was also another one called the Alligator. But the Intelligent Whale, this particular one is in the Washington Navy Yard. I was doing a tour with some group, and we went to Washington. It was not my part of the tour. Someone else took over at that point. That was their expertise. But they let us off the bus and told us to walk around the Washington Navy Yard. I don't know if you've been there, but I stumbled into this room. It was really, really hot that day. There was no air conditioning. And I looked up and I saw a sign that said Intelligent Whale. I thought, oh my gosh, there it is. And, Jules Verne, as we talk about the importance of science, Einstein said, imagination's more important than knowledge, right? Because knowledge has limits, imagination has none. It's the imagination that leads to inventions like this, and then the knowledge to replicate. Jules Verne, about 30 years earlier, in his writings, probably inspired the Intelligent Whale. Leonardo da Vinci did some drawings that are similar hundreds of years earlier during the Renaissance. You have the coffee mill gun. Did you know that the first machine gun was not the Gatling gun? It was actually the coffee mill gun. And it was used really early in the war in 1861, and it seems to have disappeared by 1862. But one of the more notable people who ordered it was John White Geary in his defense of Harper's Ferry. Geary was governor of Pennsylvania from 1867 to 1873. He was in command of the troops on Culp's Hill for the most part, and repelled the Confederate attacks there. But Geary, he said that they fired at a keg, and 6 of the 10 shots hit the keg. And he didn't say from what distance. So there's some obscure information on the coffee mill gun. But you would feed the ammunition in through what looks like a coffee grinder. And one other interesting point about all this, James Ripley, he was in charge of all the ordnance distribution in Washington. He was a logistics guy. And people will ask sometimes, why didn't Spencer repeating rifles enter into the Federal armies in bulk and in mass earlier? Why were there only 2 regiments here at Gettysburg, 5th and 6th Michigan, that had them? Why were they not more plentiful? Why wasn't the Gatling gun or the coffee mill gun mass produced? It would have given the Union a unique advantage earlier in the war. And one of the answers for all of the above, if you've ever had those thoughts, was James Ripley. James Ripley was older. He was from old school. He thought the war was going to be a short war. The men had learned Hardee's tactics and then a variation of that later called Casey's tactics. They had been trained to fight with infields and spring fills, and he was not going to mess with that and start mixing supply differences behind the lines and then confuse men on how they should fight. Ripley was out by the middle of 1864, though, and then you start to see those newfangled weapons, as he called them, being used in the ranks more plentifully. There was the Gatling gun then. Its two claims to fame during the war was it was used in the trenches of Petersburg the last year of the war. This may be an urban legend, but there's been a story for years that for a show of strength, it was brought to the draft riots in New York City in July of 1863. But that's sometimes disputed. It would be more commonly used in other wars, like the Boer War. The Russians purchased them, the English purchased them and used them in late 19th century wars. It was a .58 caliber. You could fire up to 200 rounds per minute. It was steel jacketed. One of the problems with the Spencer cartridge is it was copper with the Spencer repeating rifle, and it would heat up and melt and jam. Some of you know that. But this Gatling gun was foolproof with a steel jacket. And let's see where we need to wind down here. 1862, you have the Springfield, and then you have the Enfield that were produced at armories, various armories. And the biggest producer, of course, would be Springfield, Harper's Ferry, but there were some other armories. And the soldiers carried them in the field. And one of the problems with the rifle was parabolic trajectory. If you've been with me on tours out in the field, you've heard me say that on occasion. Parabolic trajectory is the arc flight to a rifle. If you've ever fired a rifle even now, you don't fire the barrel level. Because of the curvature to the flight, the ball will curve right into the ground way short of its mark. So if you're firing at something a football field's distance or more, you need to slightly raise the rifle. So you aim high, and then the ball curves. And there's a precision to all of that. Well, Earl Hess, in his controversial book on the rifled musket, argues that the rifled musket during the Civil War was less effective than the smoothbore musket in other major European battles. He uses the example of the Battle of Prague, the Battle of Austerlitz. These are battles that either involved Frederick the Great or Napoleon, where the smoothbore musket casualties, he said, were upwards of 28%, whereas the rifled musket in Civil War battles accounted for 10% of the casualties. Now, why? You think, well, the rifles, this is why the book is so controversial. Why would that be? Why would that be the case? Because of parabolic trajectory and because they were still firing with weapons before the era of smokeless gunpowder. So no matter if you're firing with a precise weapon and you can't see after the first couple of volleys, the precision is gone, right? Visibility is key to precision. So the attacker, so you fire high, and so what the attacker does is they go through low ground. I've told some of you this a number of times over the years. The reason Pickett's troops went through that low ground beyond the Cadore building, they marched towards the Cadore buildings because Union artillery wouldn't fire directly at the house or the barn. The barn was a little bit smaller then. It was about half the size it is. Hey, let me give you a quick example. You know how you're driving down 81 and you pull up behind a tractor trailer. And if you get close, you can let off the pedal because he's pulling you. You know what I'm talking about? It's called drafting. And it's because that tractor trailer is big enough, it's creating a vacuum of air around you. And then when it closes off around your car, you're in that vacuum and that pocket's just pulling you down the road and you can just but you're supposed to disconnect. Why? Because your engine will overheat if it's not using its own fan after a while. So I thought I'd put that precaution in there for you. The Cadore barn in the house then would have been, think of it as a vacuum that Union artillery could not curve around. Now, if you know how to hook a golf ball, I suppose you could fire a draw or a fade or something like that. But Union artillery couldn't go around that barn. That's one of the reasons why the Confederates were guiding on it at least part of the way. And you see in their accounts they mention seeing this conspicuous red building in the march. Marching towards that red building would have obscured, maybe a third to half of the Union artillery. Now, when they crossed the road, they were in low ground. And if you read Armistead Long's account, he was on Lee's staff, he doesn't mention copse of trees or anything like that. What he mentions is the Confederates were trying to get into that low ground. Why? Because if you're standing on a ridge and you're Hall or Harrow or Webb's brigade of Hancock's Corps, Gibbon's division, and you're firing off that ridge and you're having to aim high to reach the barn, and the Confederates are in low ground and you add smoke, a lot of those shots go over their head. Can you see that? And so they were trying to move. By the way, we're doing history at a higher level when we look for patterns across time and space. Patterns tell us something deeper about ourselves. So apply that pattern everywhere you go, that attacks during the Civil War always go through the lowest possible ground. Even if the ground isn't the size of the Grand Canyon, if it's enough of a depression, it plays games with the parabolic trajectory and the accuracy of someone who's firing at them from high ground. Vis-a-vis the Confederate attacks on Little Round Top and Devil's Den went through Plum Run Gorge. The Confederate attacks on McPherson Ridge went through a quarry and Willoughby Run. You pick low ground. The Confederate attacks against Culp's Hill were launched from Rock Creek Valley Ravine. Low ground, firing from high to low ground with parabolic trajectory and smoke is very difficult. So that's a counterpoint about the importance of rifle technology. But you had sharpshooters, and they would go out between the lines and they would occupy points to fire at you when you crossed an obstacle like a fence. And they waited for that moment and fired at you. If you want to look for skirmish markers on the battlefield, find the nearest fence or the nearest creek and then back up about 50 yards, and that's where the line was. They make the enemy pay for crossing that obstacle. So sharpshooters were out in no man's land. They learned how to fire a rifle with the advantages of that new technology. The average soldier in the ranks just fired 3 shots a minute, 4 shots a minute behind a wall of smoke, didn't know what they were firing at. Accuracy was reduced by the smoke, parabolic trajectory. The sharpshooter went out far enough in front of the lines where the smoke cleared. They separated sometimes 15 to 50 yards so that they would have the smoke clear and they would have one clear shot after another. Now, there were ethical problems with that. 19th century people were very concerned about shooting at someone when they were not defending themselves. But sharpshooters were introducing the rifle as a new technology. Did you know the Confederates used rifling to keep Union artillery from being as effective? Do you recognize McGilvery's battery there near the Pennsylvania and 1st Minnesota Monument? Okay, over on the far left of the Union defense against Pickett's charge. And do you see the George Weichert farm beyond that? Okay, the woods to the right of the George Weichert farm, a little bit further to the right out of our view, would be called Trossel Woods. And the Confederates, after the fight in the wheat field on July 2nd, mostly the 18th Mississippi, sent their best squirrel hunters to climb the trees. Not unlike someone working on a utility pole, working their way up to the top to work on the transformer box. And they just shot constantly at McGilvery's guns. If you go over there today, the Pennsylvania Monument, you'll see all those guns aligned, and there are lunettes in front of them. These crescent moon-shaped lunettes. They're earthen mounds. And why were they built? To absorb incoming sharpshooter fire, as well as explosive shell. Isn't that fascinating? Now, what were the sharpshooters trying to do? They were not only trying to weaken the Federals and kill a number or wound a number of their artillerymen. That would cut down on the efficiency during the cannonade, where if you have to sequester infantry and do on-the-job training to replace people that have been wounded, you don't fire 2 shots a minute with artillery, do you, during the cannonade? So it was the Confederates were using sharpshooters to soften up the Union line, the artillery, before they made their charge. Secondly, by positioning sharpshooters to continually shoot at McGilvery's 6th Maine and some of those other units, it sent a message of don't dare think of counterattacking with your artillery. If you advance with your artillery, we'll take out every one of them. In Napoleon times, you could advance artillery in a charge. By the Civil War, there were no artillery charges. Why? Because of sharpshooters. So we answer the so what question there. And then this is the last portion of it, and probably my favorite point. We'll fly through it here, but it's the idea of the art of war as it relates to field fortification technology. Jomini versus Gay de Vernon. And these two thought processes competed with one another all throughout the war, with arguably Gay de Vernon's concepts winning out. But before the Civil War began, there were two schools of thought on how you should fight Napoleonic war. The Jomini school of thought said you should mass troops on a critical point of mass, overwhelm it. That is, leave parts of your line even vulnerable to counterattack so that you overwhelm the most important point on the battlefield, vis-a-vis the continual Confederate attacks on Culpsell and then the Confederate attacks up the Emmitsburg Road were supposed to sandwich the Union line at Cemetery Hill, disconnect the Federals from that, cut the head off, separate the Union Army in two, forcing them to fall back across logistical wagons somewhere closer to Maryland. Right? And so that's why you have that. Lee believed in critical mass on one point. Grant did too. But that was the Jomini thing. Put troops, mass them, overwhelm a point, and then all the other pieces will fall into place. But what was starting to replace that with modern war was Gay de Vernon's ideas that, and you can see his book on the right, Science of War and Fortification. He was arguing, no, leave a leaner, meaner, smaller force with field fortifications that will make them larger. So instead of putting 5,000 troops in one location for critical mass, put 1,500 troops there and learn how to throw up field fortifications, which will turn them into a 5,000-man force if you know how to build them. You see what I'm saying? And that way, you can not put all your eggs in one basket, all your chips on the table with critical mass. Instead, you can spread those troops out to cover passes, to cover pontoon bridges at key river crossings, to cover symbolic places, to cover naval yards, to cover Army headquarters. You can diversify where you place everyone by just learning the technology of field fortifications. And by the end of the Civil War, his ideas were gaining traction. Gettysburg is considered a pivotal moment. Some of you heard me in my lecture a couple months ago say that the Battle of Gettysburg is sometimes referred to as the last romantic battle. That's imperfect language, but last romantic battle means the last battle where people stood out in the open to some degree, toe-to-toe, and fought each other like a gentleman's duel on a grand scale. And you face your accuser out in the open and restore your reputation, and you fire and back and forth. Gettysburg, though, like all historical events, is more complex than that. Larry, you know that field fortification technology was being subtly introduced into this battle. It was not full-blown trench warfare, but there was field fortification technology. As you look at East Cemetery Hill, for instance, this is a photograph taken a few days after the battle, looking from the Baltimore Pike to the north. And where you see the trees and some fallen brush, if you look through a magnifying glass, you'll see abattis and palisades there. Abattis in the era before barbed wire were branches or small woods that you would cut, and you sharpen the end just like a pencil and stick it in the ground to impale your opponent if they didn't watch their step as they came towards the artillery. It's a way of slowing them down, create points where the enemy has to stop and you get a clear line of fire at them. And if you read Harry T. Hayes' account, he commanded the Louisiana Brigade at Gettysburg, and he had charged up East Cemetery Hill. He said, we overran their abattis. He actually mentions the abattis in his account. And I remember the thrill I had in the book Journey Through Time, the first time I looked in Frasineto's book with a magnifying glass and saw the abattis. Do that yourself when you get home. Maybe that's a little strange, but in this audience, that's normal, And palisades are the same kind of thing. There are small woods driven into the ground that are sharpened. You see this picture taken from the Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse looking north towards where the Hancock and Howard monuments are now. And there's a Union regiment there. They were cleaning up muskets off the battlefield, burying the dead, and doing various other things a week after the battle when this photograph was taken. And notice over on the far right side of their tents, you see smoke. They were burning the Palisades and the Abattis and using it for firewood. So East Cemetery Hill had field fortification technology. It's just so fascinating. If you read Isaac Seymour's account, he commanded, he was on Harry T. Hayes' staff, the Louisiana Brigade that attacked East Cemetery Hill. And he said we could hear the Federals working up there like busy beavers all night. Well, he wasn't talking about Culp's Hill, he was talking about East Cemetery Hill. Isn't that fascinating? And where did they get the wood from, by the way? There was a patch of woods where Jenny Wade is today, and you all know where Rorix is. Did you know there was a patch of woods there? As a GTC bus parking lot is there now, but there was a patch of woods. That's where they were getting the wood from. Okay, and braziers were also part of the field fortification technology of this first modern war that Gay de Vernon recommended. And braziers have you ever seen a turret at the top of a castle and it has dental-like indentations? That's so you can step behind, if it's an arrow, whatever it is you're loading, you can step behind the denture and then step back into the portal and fire. And those are called embrasures. And see how the Federals built their redoubts around their artillery and placed their planks in such a way so they had walk-through points. Lunettes. And you can see the Confederates attacking East Cemetery Hill and the famous Evergreen Cemetery Gatehouse as the focal point in the background. And you can see the Federal 11th Corps up there behind their lunettes. And this is what they look like today. They were redug in the 1930s by the CCC boys. And then you have earthworks. If you go over to between McKnight's Knoll, Stevens Knoll, and Culp's Hill, and you walk up through the woods towards Culp's Hill, did you know there are earthworks up through there? Yeah, that's fascinating. They're still there. They're actually there. I think most people don't see them, and it's probably better that they don't. We want to keep it a secret. But with the woods recently being cleared there, you can see them even better. So just take your dog and walk through there at some point. And on Stevens Knoll, you can see the Iron Brigade's earthworks. They're still there. They were redug, re-entrenched in the 1930s. But they're where the Iron Brigade left them, overlooking, from Stevens Knoll out towards East Cemetery Hill. And then the breastworks on Culp's Hill, they were fairly elaborate. Here's a kind of a caricature of the 149th New York from Syracuse on Culp's Hill firing behind these fortifications. If you read Edward O'Neill's account, he commanded the Alabamians that attacked the Syracuse line on July 3rd. He said they were like log cabins at the top of the hill. The Federals actually felled and did some master craftsman work. You can see Color Sergeant William Lilly being presented there on the relief. What he did was, there's so many Confederate projectiles flew through there, it cut the staff in half for the 149th New York. So he spliced it together. Isn't that neat? So he's using a splint and putting it together so that he can plant it back and show the Confederates, discourage them from trying. There were traverses on Culp's Hill. That's all part of the Gay de Vernon idea on field fortification technology. A bonnet traverse is like a bonnet you wear on your head. That means it's a head covering. But the traverse is something that goes at right angles with the main line. And on Culp's Hill, you all recognize Dr. Fennell there, Charlie Fennell, one of our licensed guides. He's standing where the traverse is today. So if you walk over there on Culp's Hill, the earth is still risen up from the traverse that was built there by David Ireland in the 137th New York from Binghamton. But there's a mound there, and a traverse also indicates that there are compartments that protect you at right angles. So there would have been a little bit of a zigzag to the traverse. When the Confederates from Virginia, North Carolina, and Maryland attacked that position, they would have had trouble being able to approach the Federals in any direction and have a clear line of fire. Traverses also tend to have boards that go across the forehead. And we don't have precise proof that this particular traverse on Culp's Hill had one, but a lot of traverses have a board that covers the forehead. You know why? It's to prevent plunging. And the Federals might have had these headboards as well. It's like a football player has a face mask. It doesn't stop his eyes from being harmed, but it fends off a lot of blows to the head. In a similar way, a board at forehead level stops a Confederate on Lower Culp's Hill from shooting down into the ravine into the top of the head. That's called plunging. So the traverses, Big Round Top has stone walls. They were constructed the night of July 2nd. Did you all know that? And they run from the top of Big Round Top all the way to near the 44th New York Monument. Not quite that far, but almost to Little Round Top. Unbelievable. And they built them up there. The Confederates said, General Longstreet told Lee, you don't want to attack Round Top again. He told him on the morning of July 3rd, he said they've been building stone walls up there all night. They could hear the echoes of the rocks being put into place. The 20th Maine, the stone wall that's there for the 20th Maine, where Joshua Chamberlain made his famous counterattack, was not there when the 15th Alabama attacked them. It was built after the attack, in case they attacked again. And that's field fortification technology. Now, the stone wall itself would have been dressed up with abattis in front of it. It would have also been built into natural rocks that were already there. So by the time the Confederate gets anywhere near the position, he's stumbled and bumbled over all kinds of natural obstacles that the stone wall enhances. Yeah, that was built after the famous fight. The 13th Vermont Rifle Works. Can you see behind the Sergeant Brown statue in the 13th Vermont, along the fence there, how the earth has been changed? That's over on the fields of Pickett's Charge. Those field fortifications, they would have dismantled, the 13th Vermont would have dismantled that fence and laced it in with the earthwork to make it stronger and to give it vibrancy. Out in front of the Hancock Wound Monument in the fields of Pickett's Charge, out on that little plateau in front of it, there was field fortification built there too by 13th, 14th, 16th Vermont. It would have been about waist high. It would have been laced with stone, dirt, dismantled rail. And it was one of the reasons why Pickett's troops had to march in front of the Union line. They couldn't flank it because of the field fortification technology. Isn't that fascinating there? You normally never hear that, but if you look at the Kadori Thicket and how rough that is and tie that into the McGilvery's lunettes and then tie that in with the field fortification technology the Vermonters put there, the Confederates would have wanted ideally to flank Hancock's line and get reverse fire with frontal fire and roll the line up in the direction of the angle and beyond. But they were never able to flank, and then the Federals turned the trick on them by pivoting Stannard out in the field. But they were initially firing from behind fortifications. Where did those fortifications go? In 1887, a rail line was built across from Harrisburg to Gettysburg and then across the fields of Pickett's Charge, and that's when the field fortifications were leveled. The whole National Cemetery would have looked like 100 groundhogs were let loose in it. Even before the cemetery was created, the cemetery smoothed all that ground out, but there was all kinds of field fortification technology in what is now the National Cemetery. And in front of the 20th Mass marker, see those field fortifications? They're significant. That's what Pickett's troops were up against. If you read James Kemper's account to John Batchelder, it's 1871 or 1873. He wrote Batchelder. He was the governor of Virginia at the time. He had been in Pickett's Charge, was wounded. He wrote Batchelder and he said, I didn't allow any of my men in the preliminary hours before, we call it Pickett's Charge, before the attack, to leave their swells and walk to the top of the ridge where the artillery was. He said, I didn't want them having a look at the field fortifications. He actually mentions them. They must have been formidable. And then we have the stone wall at the high water mark. Now, how many of you have noticed the new stone walls that are being put up out there? Okay, now, they're not exact. There are some differences, and people have raised concerns and that kind of thing, although I think all those concerns have been addressed, and the park's been real attentive to that. But they're meant to represent where the stone walls originally were, and we're trying to put stone walls that had been removed with the construction of the cyclorama. Now that it's gone, The cyclorama's been demolished. We're putting those old original stone walls back up. But occasionally somebody will look at the representation walls that we put up in the last 9 or 10 months, and they'll say, could they have really been that tall during the battle? And the answer is yes. Look at this handshake in 1938 at the angle where Pickett's charges repulsed. Look how high up they are. And the 69th Pennsylvania, they felled trees in the copse of trees to create abattis all out in front of that position. Did you know there were sharp, the copse of trees were not very tall, but they extended out towards the Emmitsburg Road, and all those trees were ground down like an orchard manager prunes down an orchard to just knobs, sharpened knobs. The Confederates call that, the area all in front of the copse of trees, the slashing. Slashing, have you ever been to, into a forest where they felled a lot of trees, and maybe the trees have been drug out of there, but there's still a lot of, there are a lot of debris lying around that you better not walk through without steel-tip boots. You know what I'm talking about? That's slashing. The 69th Pennsylvania, 71st, 72nd, 106 Pennsylvania, 59th New York, they put all of that, those sharpened abattis obstacles out in front of the line. Okay, so our summary conclusion. The 19th century has been compared to a driver who looks in the rearview mirror at what is behind them while they drive down the highway at 65 miles an hour. Similarly, generations that lived between 1800 and 1903 witnessed the steam train, steamboat, steam factory, steam press, photography, telegraph, telephone, X-ray machine, electric grids, combustible engines, and first flight, even as they clung to the past. With all this rapid change, they still look to pre-modern traditions for meaning with their Victorian dress, manners, social values, and class structure. They fixated on the past while charging full steam ahead. The American Civil War represents the clashing of pre-modern and modern worlds in favor of modernization. The war became a testing and proving grounds for the modern world. Thank you for coming out today. Yes, coming out all winter.